Welcome, everyone, to yet another lecture in the CAPE lecture series. My name is Mary Woods. I am a retired professor of the history of architecture and cities from the architecture department here at Cornell. And I'm very pleased and honored to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Elissa Sampson. Her lecture today is entitled The Resurgence of Memory, the Living Legacy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. This lecture is especially well timed because March 25th, this coming Friday, is the anniversary of the 1911 Triangle Fire in New York City. Here, 146 young women, chiefly Jewish and Italian immigrants, perished. Dr. Sampson's lecture will place this historic tragedy in relation to not only collective memory, but also current activism around labor, feminism, immigration, and racial justice. Sadly, this lecture is also all too timely because of the January 2022 fire that claimed the lives of West African immigrants and other families of color at the Twin Parks high-rise in the South Bronx, now the site of New York City's worst fire in many decades. Twin Parks and the Triangle Factory deadly fires and the collapse of the South Champlain Luxury Tower in South Florida underscore that issues of building codes, enforcement, and structural integrity are not only still present, but also cut across divides of class, race, and gender. Dr. Sampson's research of the 1911 disaster at the Triangle Factory draws extensively on those archives that are housed at ILR's Kheel Center. And we are very fortunate today that Wesley Chenault, director of the Kheel Center, and Stephen Calco, research archivist there, are joining us today for the discussion and the Q&A following the lecture. But Dr. Sampson has also very kindly said if you have particularly pertinent questions germane to what she's speaking about at the moment, she'll be glad to respond to them. So she'll be very much in the moment with us. I also want to thank Lisa Earle, who's the president of CAPE, and the always indispensable Cynthia Robinson for their unstained support of this lecture and for making it happen. Dr. Elissa Sampson studies urban places and how the past is actually actively used to create new spaces of migration, memory, heritage, and activism. She's a visiting scholar in Cornell's Jewish Studies program, where she teaches courses on Jewish cities, including New York's Lower East Side. Her lifelong interest in migration and culture were nurtured by her own residence on the Lower East Side, Brooklyn, Paris, and even centrally isolated Ithaca now. She received her doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a dissertation focusing on how the Tenement Museum on New York's Lower East Side has shaped histories of immigrant lives and their stories. Her published work addresses the historic and contemporary Lower East Side, the Yiddish theater, and the Jewish left from the Popular Front to the Cold War, as well as the Triangle Factory Fire. And let me tell you, if Elissa is giving a walking tour of the Lower East Side, you should sign up as soon as possible. She knows it intimately, not only as a scholar, but also as the home of her Polish Jewish immigrant ancestors. She is absolutely terrific. So I hope she will inform us of her next walking tour. She not only studies activism and advocacy, but she was also instrumental in saving and then giving new life to the Stanton Street Synagogue, now one of the few remaining tenement synagogues on the Lower East Side. Elissa has also shared her knowledge in such documentary films as Streets Matzah and The American Dream, and a PBS documentary feature about the Triangle Factory Fire. And she's also a much sought after expert by the media, most recently appearing on a CNN segment on the Twin Parks tragedy in the South Bronx. In 2017, she was honored with the Lower East Side Community Hero Award. Her work has received support from the Cornell Center for Social Sciences and the Central New York Humanities Corridor Project. Now, for complete details about her many and varied achievements, please see, the two messages I sent you through chat. They contain the URLs for her profile on the Cornell Jewish Studies program, and then Wesley and Stephen's staff profiles for the Kheel Center at Catherwood Library. Just two bits of housekeeping, starting with myself. Please mute your Zoom mics now. And as I say, if you have particularly germane and pertinent questions, please post them to chat. I think Wesley and Stephen are going to help me to decide if those are actually in the moment questions or if they should be reserved until the end. So now please join me in welcoming our speakers and panelists to Cape, where the coffee is good and the parking is free, in the words of Cynthia Robinson. Thank you very much.
Taking a sip of virtual coffee here. I'm going to be talking about the Triangle Fire and its growing commemoration today in a new age of global sweatshops, which represents a compelling broadening of the collective memory of the labor movement and of Jewish and Italian immigrant descendants into a growing social justice activism encompassing immigrants, essential workers, Black Lives Matters, and the Bronx Twin Parks fire. This resurgence of memory accompanies the mourning of those who perished in a preventable but predictable tragedy. An inextinguishable story is not being allowed to die. The circulation of contemporary commemoration and memorialization reinforces remembrance as well as activism in a wide variety of communities. The memory of the Triangle Fire has been recuperated in novel, creative ways that bring in new airs to the story. Annual commemorations fill nearby streets with union and other activists. A fire department shows up. People in New York City, pay attention to that. People chalk at the addresses of those who perished. Poetry is published. The Philharmonic commissioned a full orchestra piece on immigration from Julia Wolfe, A Fire in My Mouth, which features 146 female voices. And not least, a memorial is in the making, designed so as to interact with street life at the site of the fire, a garment factory building that became part of NYU. The ability to resurrect the Triangle Fire story is directly related to inequality and a changing U.S. labor movement, well aware of the globalized garment trade. The origins of this story are literally grounded in the sense that an injustice was done in 1911 when the owners of a sweatshop were not convicted for locking its 9th floor fire doors. But first, I'll rehearse, with your permission, a bit of history that provides the context as to why a story of the unquiet dead still haunts and inspires. Hold on 2 seconds. Yes. Thud. 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 New York World reporter William Gunn Shepard called in the story. Heard 62 thud deads and put it into his phone dispatch. So here is a story of how the age of industrialization collided with the age of mass immigration. Let me take you through hearing about the fire itself, since it goes a long way to explaining why justice, demanded in the name of the dead, is asked for the living. One of Zoom's real advantages is that it allows for a broader geographic reach in terms of audience, which is a fitting metaphor for this talk, given that those who hear the story of the fire become part of a retelling that lets it live on elsewhere. What's wrong with the building and the factory? After all, it's advertised as fireproof, which, among other things, lowered the payments for its insurance. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory has 3 floors, 2 dark staircases with blocked entrances, locked doors on the 9th floor, a collapsed fire escape, work tables that blocked egress and were covered with flammable material. The 8th floor calls the executive showroom on the 10th floor, which exits onto the roof. But the 9th floor has very few choices. The 8th floor makes it down through elevators, staircases, and other means. Shepard and Francis Perkins, who we'll hear more about, happened to be at nearby Washington Square Park and became eyewitnesses to, quote, an industrial disaster. Shepard also wrote about the fire truck and ladder that couldn't reach the 7th floor. And like Mary, I would like to give an accolade or a shout out, if you prefer, to the Kheel Center with its archives and website, because they are absolutely critical. Without them, it would have been literally impossible for the story to remain in circulation, let alone be reinforced and reactivated. Please ask about that in the Q&A, and these photos are from the Kheel Center. Who owns the story is one that we see in the question of the tensions around 1911, and its memorialization and funerals, and yes, it's a multiple word. You see the slogan attributed to Joe Hill, "Don't mourn, organize." You can see in the photo here on the Lower East Side, "We mourn our loss." Again, the we. And you can see in the Hebrew, which comes from the Bible, from Deuteronomy, the expression "tzedek tzedek tirdof," or "justice, justice, thou shalt pursue." So these are productive but difficult tensions on labor, ethnicity, New York City itself, gender, suffragettes, namely the role of women's work and women working. We mourn our loss, but whose story is it? It was fought back in the day, not least since New York City's authorities wanted to tamp it down. Some historians argued that decisions were made to stress labor and portray Jews and Italians as workers and downplay that they were immigrants. But perhaps we can decide that this overused word intersectionality can help here. Today's activists have realized that they don't have to take up all of the battles from the past and coming together to mourn, tell stories, and organize. This year's theme is Mourn the Dead, Fight for the Living. Today's interventions that keep the story alive reflect old tensions as well as new ones in advocating for permanent memorialization, funding priorities, annual rallies, and the shift to new eras. Excuse me. So we have here the 1909 uprising of 20,000 and the figure of Clara Lemlich, who's pictured at this mural with a sewing machine. The mural was actually on the wall of a former synagogue that's now a community center in the Lower East Side. And the slogan from the strike that she led in 1909 is, "We'd rather starve quick than starve slow." And she calls at Cooper Union for a general strike, Cooper Union being the place to go if you want to have a large rally at that point. But there's a larger context here that's worth mentioning, and that context I call ready wear, and the shirtwaists or the blouses that were symbols of the new woman. By 1910, New York City is the largest producer of U.S. garments. 70% of ladies' garments were ready wear and 40% of men's garments. Sweatshop labor increasingly becomes a national debate as ready wear becomes more common and immigrants more visible. The growth of manufacturing lofts, there's enormous labor unrest. The Lower East Side is the world's densest urban area with the worst labor and living conditions. By the turn of the century, some 40,000 workers, 4 out of 5 of whom were immigrant women, were employed in the manufacture of shirtwaists. And this number starts growing rapidly by 1910. To provide even some more context here, female new immigrant workers were viewed as unorganizable, flighty, and certainly not as breadwinners by their fellow male unionists. Nonetheless, given immigrant poverty, these young girls and women were breadwinners, critical to a family economy, and they were paid even less than men for their labor. We talk about allyship today, but without the support of the WTUL, or the Women's Trade Union League, who were suffragettes, and they were respectable, often wealthy society women, the strike would not have had a chance at all. And here is a picture of Clara Lemlich at age 23 when she makes this call for a general strike, a strike of all unions. And to the right is Cooper Union and Samuel Gompers speaking. So the first thing that's worth mentioning about the strike of 1909, or the uprising of the 20,000 as it's called colloquially, is that it's the first and largest women-led strike in America. Again, the WTUL is critical here. Local 25 at the point that Lemlich calls for the strike arguably had all of $4 in its treasury. So it's the WTUL who literally funds and defends them and bails them out daily. Now that call for a general strike, which would affect small garment shops as well as the three largest, is important because those three largest included the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and it was seen as the most egregious employer. You can see the quote from Lemlich on the first bullet. The second bullet is actually the oath that was taken by the people who were there who voted for the general strike, because everyone needed to have each other's back in order to be able to pull this off. This is a strike that, depending on exactly how you want to count it, because there were wildcat strikes before, that's going to last from 11 to 13 weeks. Again, the WTUL raises funds not only daily to bail out these young women when they get arrested and beaten up, which is the case. Lemlich herself lost a number of teeth and her ribs were broken. But they rent the Hippodrome and have a rally there, and they follow that up by a fundraiser at Carnegie Hall. Lemlich, by the way, was not necessarily appreciated by the male trade unionists when, after 2 hours of hearing them speak, she called for a general strike. On the other hand, the reception to what she said was overwhelmingly positive by the part of the audience, which was mainly young females such as herself. So to understand a little bit more about Local 25, which were the shirtwaist makers in this uprising, we have the shirtwear kings, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, who owned the largest firm, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Each operator had 6 people working for them, and they were mainly greenhorns or new immigrants, or greener, if you prefer in Yiddish. The conditions at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were the ones that arguably were most salient in sparking the 1909 strike. And you have the small garment firms settle rapidly, but not the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So again, it's greenhorns that mainly took these jobs because these conditions were considered so terrible. 70% of those garment firms settled. We don't actually know how many workers were employed by the firm, by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, because most were subcontractors and did piecework. On March 25th, tragedy strikes, and it's the perfect, predictable, and preventable storm. Approximately 500 people were in the building on that day at 4:40 p.m. Typically, more than 10,000 shirtwaists per week were made during the season. On floor 8, because there are 3 floors here that are owned by the factory, approximately 150 workers, cutters, and sewers worked primarily with flammable cotton, floor 9, had 278 sewing machines. Of the over 200, perhaps 250 people there, they were surrounded by scraps and they were working with fabric that has been called more combustible than paper. Almost all the 146 who died were on that floor. The 9th floor also had small barrels of oil used for lubricating the sewing machines. Oil-soaked floorboards proved perfect fire starters. And again, the fire doors were locked, and we'll talk more about that. 2 weeks later, on April 11th, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, our shirtwaist kings, were indicted by a grand jury for the deaths of Mary Herman and Margaret Schwartz, who had tried to get those fire doors open. The trial on April 11th hinged on Harris and Blank clearly knowing that the door was locked. After 2 hours of deliberation, they were not convicted. The all-male jury had one manufacturer and one distributor. The 2 men ultimately collected a large chunk of insurance money, $60,000, more than the fire had actually cost them in damages. Harris and Blank had made a profit from the fire of $400 per victim. The victims' families got $75. By 1918, they were out of business as partners, but we are left with the dead. They're dead. 146 immigrant workers, 20 men and 126 women, the average age of whom was 19. Oh, and according to the trial transcript, because the doors were locked to prevent pilfering, the estimated annual cost of pilfering would have been $25. And this was the excuse for narrowing the exits and putting in screens that served as checkpoints to allow for handbags to be checked. As you can see here, this is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, but it's in the Ash building right after the fire. And you can see the 7th, 8th, and 9th floors where they've burnt. But the building itself is a 1901 fireproof building for which approval was obtained not to have a third fire staircase and to have only one fire escape. The drop ladder on that fire escape was never installed. And the fire escape itself collapsed as the weight on it increased. The small exits on floors 8 and 9 had guards at doors designed for one person at a time to exit, since those bags were inspected going out. Those doors had a wooden partition. Heavy metal doors opened inwardly. It's the secondary exit door to the secondary staircase on the 9th floor that was locked. These were purposeful design floors meant to limit fast egress. City engineering witnesses at the trial recommended inspections by the fire department, sprinklers, fire escapes, and the building department was criticized roundly for not doing inspections. So everybody in the city who was responsible, in theory, pointed fingers. But publicly, the building was rectified in 1912 to look like nothing had happened there, and it was made safe. Its owner, Joseph Ash, had architects correct defects, including adding a new fire escape, removing the iron shutters on the staircase windows, constructing 2 large water tanks on the roof, and installed a modern sprinkler system. By 1915, NYU rented the 8th floor where the fire had started. A year later, plans were announced to install the library and classrooms. In 1918, the school took over the 9th floor, and a year later expanded to the 10th. By the 20s, the university had taken over the entire building. So in terms of tropes of disaster, we're going to see different airs here. And we get a sense already with the city and the trial, there's going to be reckonings and blames and responsibilities, especially once the trial of the owners fail. But one of the things that is most interesting here is how gender plays out. And the Women's Trade Union League is involved in organizing a mock funeral procession, which is not to say something is made fun of, but they staged their own funeral procession with the ILGW, as well as Jewish and other unions, most particularly Local 25. So with gender here, the mock funeral and the public spectacle was key to obtaining sympathy for action. On April 5th, 10 days after the fire, more than 500,000 New Yorkers lined the streets of Manhattan and marched in a funeral parade for the Triangle victims in pouring rain, 8 miles. Now, this was supposed to be the funeral of the last 7 unidentified bodies. The city was so worried about labor unrest that it insisted on having a private funeral that nobody could attend. So the WTUL and the ILGW organized its own funeral. So who owns the narrative is contested, even as it brings together people at the same time. Whose story it is was fought back in the day. Approximately 150,000 mourners followed a single empty black hearse, and 250,000 onlookers lined the route from start to finish. It took 4 hours for all the marchers to pass under the Washington Square Arch. In all, close to 500,000 people participated in either the spectacular display of public mourning or in the other processions that day. So some of the divisions that we see here in terms of the owner of the story, or who gets to claim ownership of the story, better said. Is it labor? Is it immigrants? Is it along lines of gender? Is it along lines of class? And these are themes that are going to pop up continually. Now, the Jewish community in Eastern Europe, which had migrated very rapidly after 1881, they're part of the new immigrants, along with Southern Italians. About a third of East Europe's Jews migrate in a very rapid period of time, less than 40 years. And the migration starts sort of officially after the assassination of a Russian Tsar in 1881. The Jewish community is very familiar with tropes of disaster. Communal disaster is the order of the day in the Pale Settlement, with the May laws and the pogroms and all sorts of destruction. So we have poetry, we have music, sheet music, mind you, that you can buy for 50 cents, among other things. And we have editorials and cartoons and art. This, the one to my right here, shows a capitalist monster who eats his children. The Italian community also is extremely familiar with tropes of disaster. 1906, Mount Vesuvius erupts. In 1908, we have one of the world's worst earthquakes in Messina, in Sicily. So with these communal disasters, they also have rituals of mourning and understanding communal disaster, which they bring to the table. And I'm showing you a few pictures here. One is of Joseph Zito, and you'll notice that the postcard here says he was an elevator boy, though clearly he's a man. And he ran the elevators along with a colleague. He ran them for 4 hours. He ran them for a number of hours until literally the elevators collapsed under the weight of the people who had climbed on top of them. But most of the people who got off the 8th floor were able to exit because he kept those elevators going. 4 hours after the fire, workers discovered a lone survivor in the building, and that was Joseph Zito, trapped in rising water at the bottom of the elevator shaft with a broken leg. To your right is actually a family new portrait that was commissioned by the Maltese family. They're the only family that had 3 women die in this fire, a mother, a daughter, and a niece, and this is the mother and the daughter, Caterina and Rosaria Maltese. So what happens? What ensues? We have a factory investigating commission that's headed by Francis Perkins, pictured on the right. But we really want to understand more about how the fire shaped the world we live in, including its legislative legacy. legacy here in New York State and later in the WPA, because there were 36 new laws. The FIC happened since Tammany Hall, most notably Al Smith and Robert Wagner, backed it fully. FIC head Francis Perkins later stated, quote, "The people of the state saw for the first time the individual worth and value of each of those 146 people who fell or were burned in that great fire. We all felt that we had been wrong, that something was wrong with that building, which we had accepted, or the tragedy would never have happened. Moved by this sense of stricken guilt, we banded ourselves together to find a way, by law, to prevent this kind of disaster." Perkins, who headed the FIC, became the first female Secretary of Labor under FDR. But prior to that, she was the head of New York State's Labor Department under him, because FDR was also a New York State governor. But after she served as Secretary of Labor, she was also a professor at the ILR school for 7 years. In acknowledging the enormous respect owed to the FIC and those who promoted its findings and promoted its laws to the WPA era, we also know, however, that industrial fires didn't stop, even though labor and safety conditions certainly improved. And this problem is one that remains for all the eras of the fires, and how you deal with the question of the legal landscape and the enforcement landscape, and what is necessary to change working, and I would argue here as well, residential conditions for New York's poorest. The children who are pictured here and the young men, one of the things that Perkins did with her FIC is she brought it upstate and started looking at mills and canneries. So these are pictures of workers in those settings. Louis Hines, for those of you who are photography buffs, did a lot of some of these photos of child workers. So when we look at sites of tragedy, we're going to see a number of things. We're going to see an initial outpouring of grief and stricken guilt. Certainly Perkins' words are pertinent in that regard, that remain in ceremonies and laws. The building becomes a site of rectification, which certainly happened, practically unmarked as blame is detached from the site. The reemergence of importance as centennials approach, opens new possibilities, including permanent memorialization. But what I'm going to focus on here with the centennial is that there is a slow, continuous emergence of retrospective meanings, which allows lessons to feel vital today and create new forms of commemoration, despite the general equivocation about inscribing sites of labor. And here I'm adding in my own words and sites that have to do with women. And those words were written by Kenneth Foote, who was head of the American Geographical Association at the turn of the century. So for the 100th anniversary, Resurgence, I will be talking about her soon, had founded in 2009, in other words, she had a head start here, the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, along with many other people and Workers United, which was the heir to the ILGWU. And in doing this, there was infused a creative energy for artists and performers that transformed the commemorations in preparation for the 100th anniversary of the fire. And here we're going to see how the commemoration memorialization can work in tandem, as described by Kenneth Foote. There are new heirs and old heirs, and they include feminist romance language departments, Italians taught some places, architects, unions, firefighters, building trades, all galvanizing a fairly attenuated story that started getting far more attention than in the past. Not least, along with labor's rebalancing, there is a rebalancing of Jewish and Italian politics of remembrance. So contemporary memorialization and commemoration require recuperating this history. And you're looking at pictures now of the 100th anniversary and before that of the 99th. So why is this historic story not dying? Because we know it's what happens to most stories of US labor tragedies. Arguably, much of this has to do with performance. A large amount of Triangle Fire activism today is telling a story that historians could not anticipate. It's a pulling together of old eras with new, of the labor movement, perhaps most especially Workers United, which served as flame keepers and holding commemorations, but it was the artists and activists intended. Part of the answer is that if you don't learn from the difficult past, you're not going to have the resources to reshape this future. Another part of the answer is the purposeful agreement of those from the garment trade and other unions who indeed fought constantly about union politics elsewhere. But they agreed to continue providing a financial and organizational base for keeping the story alive so that it could take off with new heirs. So there's a swelling reinsertion of narrative here through art, commemorations, rally, chalk, which we'll talk about, all of which is amplified by a sense of unquiet dead. It resonates with the globalization of sweatshop labor and garments and its gendered impact. Now, commemoration and memorialization are not identical impulses, and I will attempt to document both processes, even though they truly overlap here. So this gives you some of the new eras, but there are also old eras. So it's very interesting, this combination. And here are some of the creative responses to commemoration that are future facing as they bring in other new eras to an old story of exploitation. For instance, music, if you look at the center, right? That's Julia Wolf's most recently in Fire in My Mouth, which was performed by the New York Philharmonic. But it's also often voices up in remembrance and protests, as have other forms of art. The Triangle Walk, which you see on my right, is called the Final Walk Home Funeral March. People dressed in veils and in black and went to the home of every single person who lived in the neighborhood, and at their residence said their name and said, "We return you to your home." They had a cantor, they had a drummer, and it was a 4-hour march. And that again was part of the anniversary. And on the left, you see a play. And the play is Girls of the Triangle. And that was written as well for the anniversary. There is poetry, fire poetry, that has been written for the last 20 years. There are songs and plays. Literally, performance in the arts animate the story. But there clearly was an initial outpouring that has left us with an early corpus of work. We saw that song, the sheet music before from 1911. But here, we understand that something not only became attenuated, but the story itself was at risk. In part because when we ignore the past, most especially events that shape the world we live in, we're in trouble. We get not only the usual dictums about history repeating itself, but by definition, the dead can't defend themselves, but they can inspire. And that is why Walter Benjamin invokes the power of ancestors, where revolutionary energy is fueled by the memory of enslaved ancestors rather than by liberated children. So there are a lot of paradigms that arguably get inverted in the reinsertion of the story and its animation. This is a picture in 2019. 2020 in March was a bad year for obvious reasons, and that was not a live rally. And these are pictures that I took for the most part. You see that the power of place amplifies performative storytelling. And again, we're seeing some of the ways in which people who participate in a story become stakeholders in its telling here at the site where the fire happened. And we're going to see the power of place and play at chalk sites as well. On the left, you see postal workers. In the middle, towards the back, that's a fire and truck engine company, the same one that actually came in 1911. They've now moved to the Bronx, but that truck comes and actually the fire ladder gets raised to the 7th floor, at which point a sole firefighter bows his head to show that it can go no higher. And sometimes Amazing Grace is also played by the firefighters. To the right, you have Marianne Tresciati, the head of the Triangle Fire Coalition. Above her, you see Edgar Romney from Workers United, and you see as well some garment workers, ILGW, not SEIU, for those who are fussy about their trade unions here, who are marching in 2011 as a group together with banners. It's obvious that the way we understand the past inevitably shapes how we understand the present. But here, it's the present that is arguably driving a purposeful nosedive into the past. There's a consolidation of memory, whether it's of labor activists, archivists also in this case, architects, firefighters, electricians, Romance language departments, Jewish groups with new heirs. These sidewalk chalk silhouettes of 1909 strikers have Spanish and Mandarin language sashes. They offer an example of how temporality has been mixed here in an edgy infusion of the present into the commemoration of the past. Clearly invoking the original photos from March 25th, 1911, that showed the bodies laid out on the sidewalk after 62 people jumped. They are meant to inspire a type of female immigrant worker solidarity today. And for those who are familiar with Rana Plaza, this is from 2013 after the collapse of the building there. And the slogan that year was "No more fires," for obvious reasons. Localization may be an overused term, but it might be the apt term here in terms of talking about an increasing realization locally in the Lower East Side that these were racialized immigrants, the 146 who died. They were gendered. They were mainly young women under the age of 23. They were mostly greenhorns or new immigrants who lived in the area. And as you can see from the map, you can see their residences. A few, after the building of the Williamsburg Bridge, also lived in Brooklyn. And a few had even migrated up to Harlem because the subway line had been extended. I should point out that when I use the term racialized, that they were not legally racialized in the far more difficult ways seen with some other groups, notably Chinese Americans, African Americans, and Indigenous Americans. But racialized they were, nonetheless. 3/4 of Eastern European immigrants worked in the garment trade. Eastern European and Southern Italian new immigrants clustered in Lower Manhattan, which was an immigrant first destination, as the map shows. The Congressional Dillingham Commission self-appointed task was to investigate the rapid and growing immigration to urban areas of East European Jews and Southern Italians, the new immigrants, trying to stop work for them and stop their immigration because they were seen as racialized or unassimilable and undesirable as immigrants. And that is part of what made them vulnerable to employers. And the commission eventually succeeded with its agenda and have been in basically being able to pass the national quotas that we see in 1921 and 1924 that cut off immigration from these areas. So this reinsertion of memory is quite literal, but chalk is ephemeral by definition, unlike a memorial. So this is part of the distinction that you could tease out between memorialization and its sense of permanent walking of landscape versus something like chalk. In 2004, chalk starts with individual names, places, walking lives where those who died in the fire lived. It's a type of storytelling in place. When I do it, my lines are, someone who lived in a fire lived here, at which point somebody asks, when did they die? If I answer 1911, that's very confusing for them. But that if I answer, we, as in the Lower East Side, remember our own, then it's not a confusing answer for them, because the Lower East Side has a history of its own memorialization of people who died, whether it's in drug wars, of people who died in accidents, or people who died for other reasons. So memorialization is part of a living culture in the Lower East Side. So I tend to think of chalking as an exercise of engaging in temporal confusion. Place matters. Names matter. It's not just an anonymous mass of victims. It's in English, it's in Spanish, it's in Mandarin. If you look at the top, the green chalk says, I can't breathe, which was Eric Gardner's last words in Staten Island. If you look to the right, you will see two Cornell alumni, one from AAP and one from Arts and Sciences, who helped chalk about half of Clinton Street one year. And Sergal's words are worth repeating. The chalk always washes away. Will always come back next year. That's what social justice and memory is all about. It's not like it's ever over. Moving on to the memorial, it's seen as a living memorial by people in the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, which started in 2008. And it announced then a juried competition by 2012. And Richard Yunyu and Uri Wakeman submitted the winning design, which is called Reframing the Sky. And that they describe as a focus that's communal and one that is part of living memory. And so you have a Washington Place view leading to the park, which is a block away. And I'm going to quote from them. Our vision is that you can't walk by this building without thinking about the fire. The opportunity to do a memorial is one of the most meaningful ways to make space. When you are seeing the names of the victims and see them in the panel, you also see yourself. The memorial calls attention to something that keeps on happening. So again, the past and the present get merged in that living reflection in every sense of the word. Marianne Trasciatti, Sherry Kane, and a small group of organizers have pushed for this permanent memorial, not least by raising most of the money and establishing a relationship with NYU in doing so. One longtime organizer described it to me as, quote, a memorial to workers, women, and immigrants, and said that the annual commemorations are, quote, about labor, immigrants, and workers to use as a stepping off point about those issues today. I wasn't fully convinced, but I was very much convinced when she said, common knowledge has disappeared with the garment industry's larger disappearance from New York. Now's the time to do this. So productive tensions coexist in the fight against forgetfulness. The Triangle Fire's contemporary memorialization and commemoration forces a reckoning once again of the hoary 100-year-old question of whose story is it and of who's included, the how and why something is remembered and by whom. What all of these interventions have in common is a purposeful seeking to broaden the storyteller's audience, including through grabbing the attention of passerbys. They provide an interruption which offers up moments that combine commemoration with engagement. These interventions wrestle with contemporary urgent issues for the sake of the dead as well as the living. New stakeholders are welcome. The voices of newer heirs will necessarily affect how and where the story is told, whether in a newly memorialized site of tragedy or elsewhere. And if you look at the architectural renderings, you will see passerbys looking at the corner of Washington and Green Place. There are 3 small plaques there, and it's the only thing that marks the building today, which is a landmark building. But it's a landmark building because of its historical significance, not because it actually is an intact 1901 Beaux-Arts building. At the bottom left, you see some of that reflected band that you talked about. And it shows you the names of some of the people who died, but it also shows you the sky. And yes, one can see oneself reflected in it. You can see the band is both horizontal and vertical. And it is in what the Ash Building got renamed the Brown Building of Science once it was purchased by Frederick Brown and donated to NYU. Part of the memorial is to inscribe those names. So there's something called the Collective Ribbon Project, which in spring of 2021 worked on putting those names, which are going to be inscribed 17 feet from the ground. You can see how they're reflected on that in the strip, again to my left. The names will be higher and the reflection will be lower on ground, almost on ground level. So the people involved in the collective ribbon making project were primarily from Hofstra and FIT. And they also included Julia Wolf's choral singers. The project itself brought in a firefighter with his kids and their logos. But throughout, everyone had to think about what it means to promise in a slogan. We shall never forget, remember the Triangle Fire. Composer Elizabeth Swados years ago had singers in the 2011 anniversary asking her opera from the fire, will you remember us? So the coalition offers its answers here in creating a memorial that it will serve, quote, as a permanent reminder of the crucial need for workplace safety and the fundamental obligation that all workers be treated with respect and human dignity. Those are good words, but lengthy. And based on interviews from the labor perspective, I've heard many things to that effect, including that they see the memorial as about labor and immigrants and workers and as a stepping off point to talk about those issues today. But again, I think what's most salient here is the sense that people need to engage at the street level and that the common knowledge of the garment trade and its high cost have disappeared in New York, most especially since people do not make their own garments and the ones that they buy are in a global supply chain that they're unaware of and do not understand the conditions under which they're produced. So Reframing the Sky, which is the name of the memorial, has gotten a considerable amount of funding, but clearly needs more to be able to finish up. New York State kicked in $1.5 million. The labor movement foundations and private donors almost $500,000, which leaves about $1 million needed to finish up the engineering work, the revised anchoring, the masonry work. And I strongly recommend that you may want to remember the trianglefire.org site to understand this better and to understand what they believe that the memorial will accomplish in terms of a street level intervention that makes people think about both the past and the future. At the street level, for those of you interested in buildings, The panel reaching up the building is made of steel. But at the street level, they're using a new material called stone glass. And it's in stone glass, the names of those who perish will be laser cut into a steel panel overhead. The stone glass panel, which is angled a few feet off the ground, is going to be reflecting the names and the sky. The texture of this ribbon will be acid etched onto the steel surface of the memorial. Again, I encourage you to visit the website and get a sense of it for yourself. It's a long haul project by definition, and it's been interrupted by the pandemic for obvious reasons, and the more recent discovery of just how badly the interior corner wall of NYU's building needs reinforcement and stabilization. So with the March 25th commemoration coming up tomorrow, we're back to the question of what story are we going to tell? It's going to be an online commemoration, given the pandemic politics of this year. And it's going to have to start with the basics, which is really the immigrant Lower East Side, which was the world's densest urban area and had its worst housing and working conditions. But how do you connect the Triangle Fire dead to social justice today, and why? It's not obvious given the different paths that memorialization has taken elsewhere and the different goals of the old heirs. And it's not just a question of industrial safety. The percentage of immigrants and migrants that is highest right now in New York City since the turn of the 20th century. Since 2000, most immigrants and migrants to New York are immigrants of color or people of color. Greenhorns or new immigrants were the lowest rank of immigrant back in the day. But we have other dynamics here as well. And not least, the pandemic in its own way has sharpened activism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that new labor activism here before I talk about the Bronx. So I call this new labor activism Workplace Plus. It brings in the immigrant-migrant themes and activism. They merge along the lines of typically income, racial, and gender inequality, the precariousness of globalization of labor and migration. They take into account the Chinatown garment workers' strike of 1982, which was organized by the LGWU, takes into account what has happened recently in the Bronx, as Mary mentioned, with the Twin Parks fire. And it looks to be inclusive of social movements today, whether they're Black Lives Matter, Latinx, BIPOC, or anything else. And this year, the commemoration will be promoting permanent memorialization. And that was not an obvious development, at least to me, a year after the centennial anniversary. So we have some parallels here in terms of vulnerable immigrants and migrants. And they have to do with affordable housing and fire and safety, immigrants of color, and expendable workers. So I'm going to start off by explaining a little bit about the fire. Smoke kills. On January 9th, Sunday morning, there was a 5-alarm fire, which left 17 people dead, including 8 children, over 60 people injured, through smoke inhalation, since dark smoke fed by oxygen went all the way to the 19th floor and kept on growing and billowing. These immigrants who lived in Twin Parks, Northeast, were primarily from West Africa, and they were living in subsidized housing. The parallels in the crisis of inequality is exemplified here by the precarious lives and housing for new immigrants of color. But this also means that the story is not going to go away for New York City, and presumably not for the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition. Affordable housing is critical, and it's also critical that it be safe. The Twin Park tragedy could have been avoided with the enforcement of self-closing fire doors, the installation of sprinklers, and a simple buyback program for old electric heaters, which short out. Pandemic coverage at its best has let readers understand that existing health, work, and residential disparities have deepened and become increasingly salient with very palpable consequences. And of course, in a pandemic, this cannot be isolated from larger public health consequences. So just a word here about this 1972 fireproof building. We have staircases that are smoke chutes. We have old electric heaters. We have broken self-closing fire doors. We have violations, multiple. We have elevator loads, which are insufficient. And we have no fire drills or posted safety plans. We also have a problem, particularly in Section 8 housing, that there is lax enforcement and maintenance. And social housing, which means that architecture cannot be the full answer. And I say this in part because this was an incredibly famous development. This was part of Ed Woge's urban planning, along with Mayor John Lindsay, for 1,900 income-restricted units on sites scattered around the neighborhood near Bronx and Crotona Park. It was funded and built by New York's Urban Development Corporation. I've done some research on this. I found over 8 agencies that were involved in the last few years in taking this housing, which is scatter site housing, but this particular part of the development, right, the Northwest development of Twin Parks, which was done by Prentice and Chan, a very storied firm. And it was this part of the development that went Section 8 and was subsidized so that the new owners, which were LLC, Limited Liability Corporation, were guaranteed a certain level of profit. Nobody wrote herd among those agencies about maintenance, enforcement, fixing of prior code violations, or what could be done to upgrade those structures, which needed some work. The reason that you have a tower is as large as 19 stories without fire escapes is it stopped being needed in New York City in the late 60s because it was assumed that if you had concrete reinforced floors and ceilings, your building was fireproof. So part of my own conclusion here is that it's not only that architecture can't do the full heavy lifting, because again, this was a very storied complex with very famous names like Richard Mayer and others associated with it, but that there are real code changes needed to reimagine the nature of social housing. And that brings us back to the Triangle Fire, because code changes as well as enforcement and maintenance were needed to be able to shift a paradigm. So I'm going to end here with the resurgence and memory of the Triangle Fire today. We see a coalescing of social justice advocacy across sectors, which brings us back to the question of the WPA 1930s legislation. The changes wrought and unrealized by the WPA have taught us, among other things, that mourning is iterative. It's not a one-shot deal. And the lessons get imbued slowly, but can be a catalyst for change. With the Triangle Fire, the FIC passed 36 laws in 3 years, got the governing Democratic Party machine politicians on their side, and pulled off the New Deal legislation, which made factories safer and healthier. But we know that industrial and residential buildings are both critical, especially for the vulnerable immigrants whose safety depends on it. Better design laws are a necessary starting point, but not an end point. Same with memorials. They inspire, they offer a permanent intervention. The dead get their due, and in addressing the past, we reimagine the future which means that the real work is just beginning. And the photo that you see here is of Rose Rosenfeld Friedman, who's the last Triangle Fire survivor. I pictured her here, and I hope she will get displayed alongside photos of her factory sisters who perished, and alongside the photos of those who died in Twin Parks, so as to give us a sense of what they might have become if their lives had not been tragically and needlessly cut short. I thank you to the Kheel Center, to CAPE, to the Collective Ribbon Project, to Mary Ann Tresciati, President of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, to Resurgence, to Sherry Kane, Program Director for the Workers United Education Program, to Rosa Imperato, the inimitable Resurgence, Julie Wolfe, and to so many others whose names are less known. And not least, a thank you to all of you for sitting through this talk.
Well, thank you, Elissa. I have to say, in our chat box, we only have incredible compliments to you from as far away as the Francis Perkins Center in Newcastle, Maine. And, you know, I don't think anyone really wanted to interrupt the flow of your very powerful and very beautifully constructed talk in terms of both your spoken words, your text, and your images. Perhaps to begin, what we might do in order to bring the Kheel Center and Wesley and Stephen into the conversation is, I wonder if you three might speak about the contents of the Triangle Factory files. What kinds of materials are there? What is and isn't there? I'm particularly interested, were there any interviews that were made from the women who survived the Shirtwaist Factory Fire? Were there any oral histories? So I wonder if you could give us a sense, all three of you, of what is contained in the Kheel Center archives, one of the great treasures of Cornell and of the entire United States.
I'm happy to field that question. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Calco. I'm research archivist at Kheel. So we received this amazing collection from Leon Stein, who was the International Ladies Garment Worker Union editor for many, many years. And he did a very in-depth history of the Triangle Fire and conducted amazing interviews with survivors. And in 1987, we acquired this collection of photographs, oral histories, documents. We have some things that I can share very quickly of some artifacts that we have, including some scissors that were in the building itself. Oh, sorry for the blurred background. As Elissa mentioned, some of the mourning ceremonies where they were, in New York City, and 250,000 people were demonstrating protest for the loss of all these women and young men during this. I have to unblur my background so you can see some of these. But
Yes.
This is a mourning badge from that time period, and it's from the Cloak Tailors Union Local 9, and it says, of course, we mourn our collective loss. This was April 5th, just a few days after Triangle Fire. So these are some of the more rare items that we have in our collection, including, as Elissa mentioned, the Factory Investigating Commission that really helped transform the nation's labor laws. We have the entire run of all of these reports. So they were conducted just a year after Triangle Fire, as well as any book or documentary that has ever been created about the Triangle Fire has used our archival photographs and our materials. So we have, tons of things relating to, the culture of the Triangle Fire. As Elissa mentioned, there's been, New York Philharmonic plays with Julia Wolfe that have been created, plays. Even within our collection, we have a comic book that was created a few years back. So this is kind of just a little sampling of some of the things, as well as we are the main repository for the International Ladies Garment Worker Union. We have documents artifacts, huge Union banners from its nearly 100-year history of the organization. So that's a little bit of sampling of what we have here in the archives.
So I wonder if I might ask our other two speakers. Wesley, do you have anything to say as well? We haven't heard from you. And thank you, Stephen. It's wonderful that you brought those artifacts, but I'm glad that you explained why the artifacts were kind of blurry. At first, I thought it was my eyes. So thank you very much for saying that you had to do that. So Wesley, could we hear from you a kind of larger overview? And I wonder if you might also comment, given how this wonderful talk really shows how this event has resonated across time and space, what other materials, what other archives you're acquiring that expand the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire into the present and perhaps into the future as well?
That's a wonderful question, Mary. Thank you very much. We remain in contact with a lot of individuals that, or in organizations that take as their charge or their interest or mission to upkeep the story and how it moves forward and how we remember and memorialize. So Elissa's presentation highlighted a couple of individuals. I was thinking of remember the Triangle Coalition Fire. We are working with them on the actual, kind of documentation around the creation and fabrication of the memorial that will be affixed to the building. So the actual ribbon that was created through these public programmings is something we will be housing and taking care of for perpetuity. It is a wonderful example of documentation for how this is a form of public upkeep and engagement with a variety. I mean, I think Elissa's presentation showed just how many different communities this story resonates with on multiple registers. New immigrant communities, it hits along the lines of gender, those who are interested in more of the social justice angle, but it hits on so many registers. We in fact had a family member from the namesake of the Kheel Center who has incorporated their own story into one of the panels for the ribbons. So we continue to document and collect around the event itself and how now people are continue to remember it. And we work closely with Elissa on any number of things.
Including the Jewish left.
Including the Jewish left.
Yes.
Yes, the historic Jewish left. I would like to add to the accolades here for the Kheel Center. Their collection of photos is nonpareil. And it can hit students very hard and very meaningfully. It is hard to drag a student out of the Kheel Center if you bring a class there and the class sees those photos. They are absolutely amazing. I would add to that such photos are not appropriate necessarily for a fourth grader. It's an age thing, right? And so they also, which they have neglected to mention, but not because it's not noteworthy, run one of the largest websites at Cornell, which supplies information to school teachers and students alike for New York State and elsewhere. And it's mainly social studies teachers, but not exclusively that. So they are an amazing educational resource and public-facing educational resource in every sense of the word.
And I'm free dropping a link to that for anyone interested. I think that's a wonderful point because this is incorporated in K through 12 teaching. So, I think it's important to note that, this becomes something that a younger cohort is learning about in any number of ways. But this is certainly, through a kind of formatted kind of social studies approach education our educational system. So I think that's interesting. So we see the interest in this from any number of angles. Stephen sees it as he's working directly with our different kind of patrons.
Absolutely. Let's see. As I said, are there any materials that you particularly wished you had access to when you were doing your research on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire? Things that, because I think, absence is equally telling as well as presence in some way. So what might be on your wish list, Elissa? And I mean, it's such a rich history that you have presented us with that moves across time and space. I think every, graduate student in architectural history, urban history, labor history, should hear this talk. It's so inspiring. But I'm also curious as to those things that might fall outside the archive or that the archive needs to collect in some way.
I'm not sure whether it's for the archive to collect, but in the druthers list, you have an expression from Michel de Certeau that the story cuts across the map. So one of the first places that I heard that in connection with the Triangle Fire was in reading Ulysses, which is a story, if you will, a very long story of one day in Dublin. And you have the Slocum disaster there. So I am sort of curious if the same way the Slocum disaster gets memorialized in literature, how the story cuts across the map in terms of the Triangle Fire, in terms of literature. But I'm not sure that's an archival research question. I think that might be better for somebody who does literary theory or comparative literature. There's certainly plenty of stuff in English and Italian and Yiddish.
Let's see, I wonder if we might begin to open this up to our audience. And Wesley and Stephen, maybe this is a question for you. Perhaps you could explain more about the Kheel Center and how it came into being as well. This is one question that was posed by our own Cynthia Robinson.
Stephen, you want me to jump on that one? Okay, and please chime in with anything. So the Kheel Center actually, in a different form, has been pretty much existent since the beginning of the School of Industrial Labor Relations. So when legislation was created for the creation of the school, within it were provisions for really three portions. I mean, the teaching part, and then also that there would be a library. So all these, this was built around the same time, not the physical building we're in now, but the creation of the library along with the school. And then about I think a year or so after the actual library opened, there was, I think it was called a Labor Management Documentation Center was created. So we're talking about almost 75 years now of documentation and collecting largely around issues of labor and management, and within this kind of particular sector, industrial sector. So there's been a strong relationship for a number of years between the library, between the administrative aspects of the school, and also then the teaching, kind of mission of the school. So very close relationships where the collection, matches the needs of faculty, but also then something like the Kheel Center, then we have a particular kind of different take, which is more on the archive side. It was in the 90s that then the center changes. We have Ted Kheel and his wife. They were very involved in the formation of what we have now, the Kheel Center, and created some of the important kind of streams that sustain the center to this day. The family is still very active in many respects, but it was named the Kheel Center in the 90s, and so and reflects some of his work. I mean, as an arbitrator, his interest, he and his wife's interest in civil rights. I don't mean to erase her, but I was searching for a name and hoping I could fill the space until it came to me. Ann Kheel was very much involved. So, but they had a lot of interests in some of the social issues of the day in the mid and late 60s. And so it's reflected in the number of relationships they brought to that, and the collections that have, I think, started really building in the 70s and the 80s up until today. So it's evolved over time into its current iteration. And so we still have the same mission. And it's still very much tied to that of the school, but also with Cornell University Library and how we support the kind of mission of the university in this kind of larger global context.
And I'll just interject and just mention that we have a few areas of collecting focus. The garment industry is our biggest. We are the biggest archive that documents the textile industry, both on the labor side, but we got this amazing collection from the American Textile History Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts, which adds to our management side of the collection. So we have J.P. Stevens and other big textile organizational records. But we also have other areas of focus, including the railroad industry. We have the records of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite union, Local 1199, Health and Hospital Worker Union, as well as the records of the ILR School and Management Theory. Since we are the largest archive in the world that documents both labor and management, we have a very robust archive on management theory and history. So those are a few other areas of collecting focus aside from New York unions, including Teachers Union of New York City, and many, many others.
So thank you all. I don't know why my video keeps going off. So I guess we should conclude now. This has been absolutely marvelous. Thank you all. As I say, this has been a mini symposium, and it shows us the richness of the local, the regional, the national, and also the global. So I think it's been very important. I feel very much inspired to repair to the Kheel, either online or I hope in person as well. I happen to do work on textile mills in India, and so I'm very interested to learn that you have such extensive holdings in garment workers in the textile union. So again, thank you, Elissa Sampson, Wesley Jackson, and Stephen Calco. And thank you to all who attended. And again, please thanks to Lisa Earle, president of CAPE, and Cynthia Robinson, who is our administrator.